Welcome to Changing Higher Ed, a podcast dedicated to helping higher education leaders improve their institutions. With your host, Dr. Drumm McNaughton, CEO of The Change Leader, a consultancy that helps higher ed leaders holistically transform their institutions. Learn more at changinghighered.com. And now, here's your host, Drumm McNaughton.
Thank you, David. Our guest today is Jeff Spear, CEO of CFO Colleague, a higher ed consulting firm that focuses on turning around distressed colleges. Jeff is a seasoned higher education executive with over 25 years of experience in private higher ed leadership, including multiple CFO assignments. Jeff has worked in diverse industries, including public accounting, investment banking, high-tech manufacturing, and automobile rental and sales, experiences that enable him to bring proven concepts to bear on the challenges that higher ed institutions are facing. Jeff joins us today to talk about the finances of higher education and what institutions need to do to turn around from the challenges they're currently facing. Jeff, welcome to the program.
It's my privilege to be with you today, Drumm.
Well, it's good to see you again. It's been a long time since we've been able to share conferences, et cetera, et cetera.
Understood. Yeah, we've been traveling about trying to make a difference in various different areas, and it's great to get together and compare notes.
Absolutely. And today we're going to talk about higher education finance, and it's like what needs to happen to turn this situation around. But before we get into that, Jeff, you've had a really long career in consulting in higher ed. How did you get to this point?
Well, I started out with the CPA firm of Pete Marwick Mitchell. It's now known as KPMG, and I was privileged to work with some of the people that created what was called the KPMG ratio, or CFI, back in the 80s, not knowing that I would eventually be involved in higher education. But then eventually I became a CFO, and I took a company public and then acquired a subsidiary of that was formerly a Kodak firm that manufactured projectors, and ran that for a few years and sold to somebody who wanted significantly more than we did, and wound up out of that business in 1997 and joined my alma mater as their CFO. So I came from manufacturing to higher education. Manufacturing is very data intensive. Everything is measured. Higher education claims to be data intensive. I got into higher ed and realized they don't really have a whole lot of data that they're collecting that was useful for evaluating the organization. So then I left my CFO role in higher ed in 2013 and formed CFO Colleague, which serves as operational and financial consultants for institutions, primarily private institutions all over the country. But we now have 12 professionals in that organization, and we're all over the place trying to make a difference in this market.
Well, it's interesting because your background is a, quote, non-traditional background, which in my opinion is really good and can help. I've got something, similar to that as well. How did your background in manufacturing help you in understanding higher ed finance?
In manufacturing, we realize that it is the activities that generate the financial outcomes. So if there is a variance in the cost of certain parts that you're acquiring, then you may want to look at whether you need to reduce the amount of parts you're using or replace them with something else. So we're constantly looking at the actions or activities, not necessarily the dollars per se. In higher ed, what I found when I came on board was that there was a focus primarily on the dollars, on what was being generated and what was being spent. And I thought, well, that's interesting, but there are actions that are driving those dollars. What are those actions? And how do we get down to that level so that we can drive better performance for the institution?
That's interesting because that is a very different perspective. And frankly, I don't know a whole lot of CFOs who think along those lines.
I noticed that a lot of the projection activities were merely adding percentages to dollars. and we would increase the spending, we would increase the revenues, but we didn't understand the role of the student experience in how that generated revenues. For instance, you bring in a student with a very high discount, they stay with you for 4 years, they're going to replace somebody who graduated who might not have had very much of a discount at all. Well, shouldn't we be looking at the new student coming in versus the student we lost and show replacement revenues? But instead, they looked at the new student that was brought in compared to the new students brought in last year, which really wasn't a relevant comparison, but it's how higher education was looking at their revenue stream. And we had to kind of change that mentality as we worked through the issues with these schools.
Well, we're going to come back to that perspective because I think that is really important. But we all know that higher ed is having some challenges with enrollment, with demand, with finances. But this hasn't happened overnight. This has been a long trade. Take us through some of that history, maybe starting with the GI Bill.
Right. Well, the GI Bill of Rights, they called it way back when it was signed to law 16 days after D-Day. And there were 16 million potential veterans who were going to be heading into the workforce. And the government thought, let's figure out a way to make life better for them as they come on board. In fact, this was in some ways a reaction to how World War I vets were treated, where they were given virtually nothing upon their return to the U.S. 7.8 million of those vets wound up taking advantage of the GI Bill. So in 1965, the government thought, well, why don't we just extend this concept to lower income individuals? And the Higher Education Act came out, and they created grants for those who had low incomes to attend colleges. The other issue or initiative that they presented at that point was the introduction of loans. And so students could borrow money without any creditworthiness connections at all, and could wind up financing their education that way. And at the initial start, it was thought, well, these aren't going to be very large loans. Graduates make a whole lot more money than their high school grad counterparts. So loans don't seem to be a serious issue. But then the Vietnam War comes along, and of course, young men are encouraged to enroll, and states get involved in the grant process at that point as well. So how does this all work? Well, it worked well during the 70s, but then when the Vietnam era people were not interested in heading towards school anymore, tuition discounting came along in the 1970s as a way to replicate some of the government programs. A person maybe didn't qualify for full government assistance, so tuition discounts came along. And they have grown, obviously, significantly since that particular time. But to offset the impact of discounts, schools had to increase their prices because they keep on increasing their discounts to get more money. They had to increase their prices at 2 and 3 times inflation. So you have grants, you have loans, you have discounts. And then when that all wasn't working well, we added programs and we added intercollegiate sports to the point where sports became a very significant initiative to try and increase demand for students. So we add to that the COVID hitting in 2020. Government significantly increased the amount of funding for higher education. And all these things together have brought us to today. And if we look at really what we're dealing with today, it's all related to that history.
Yeah, I get that completely. And there's a couple of other factors as well. All these dollars that were coming into higher ed during COVID were coming from the federal government, whereas you have the state governments. And how many public institutions are there out there? You know, a lot. You've got the state governments reducing the amount of money. You know, this happened back in the Great Recession. State expenditures on higher ed went up a bit, but they still went back down. And so instead of a public university's tuition being taken care of 50, 60% by the state, now it's down to 15%. Hence, right. Students need loans.
Right.
So it, as they say, it's one heck of a kettle of fish.
It is. So if I go through all those different pieces and identify what has happened as a result of them, really the government's involvement in education, whereas it has been very helpful, has encouraged schools to raise their prices significantly from a federal standpoint. From the state standpoint, as you've indicated, those schools have had to figure out a way to offset the loss of what were generous state appropriations associated with higher education. So today, here's the challenges that we're seeing. First of all, the COVID funds that we received have been used up by many institutions. And then secondly, I looked at some reports from populations, and the government believed that the population for higher ed was going to grow in the fall of 21 and 22. It showed this drop off in 2020, but it's going to come back. It did not come back. It went down in 21, and surprise, surprise, it went down again by 1.1% in 22. That was recently reported. Nakubo now says the average discount that was like in the low single digits back in 1990 is now 55%. So the price doesn't really mean a whole lot to anybody anymore. And then student loans, think about what this means. Student loans are over 1.6 trillion right now before this relief may be occurring. That represents nearly $5,000 for each American. 330 million Americans, $5,000. That's not exactly a sustainable approach. Now that will go down to around 3,000 if this relief goes through. So prices are high as well. The cost of attendance was like $3,000 in 1980. It's now approaching $40,000 even after discounts. Mm-hmm. And then some of the smaller non-selective schools have over 60% intercollegiate athletes among their ranks. So they've gone wholesale into the athletic recruiting. So all this comes together now, and a number of, particularly the smaller non-selective schools are struggling. But then we face this demographic cliff. Yeah. And we know it's coming. I mean, this is an industry where we know 18 years in advance how many students are going to be available for our market. And we're seeing a cliff in the fall of 2026 that will result in a significant decline. So add to this the Great Resignation, add to this significant inflation, and we are facing some pretty challenging times, particularly for the smaller and non-selective institution.
Mm-hmm. And lay on top of that the skepticism about a higher education degree, regardless of the data, which says if you have a degree, your earnings are going to be, hundreds of thousands of dollars more over your lifetime. There's still that skepticism out there.
That's exactly right. And here's the interesting thing about that people don't seem to take into account, and that is, yes, you will likely make more money in your lifetime than what you've borrowed, but that doesn't help you when you're in your 20s. Mm-hmm. You're trying to buy a house, you're trying to maybe get married and have a family, and you've got two people perhaps who have significant loans, and they have to make those payments well before they will see the benefits of their education, providing higher amounts of money.
Exactly right. I had a couple of guests on from the Georgetown Center for Higher Education, and they were saying that exact thing. The folks coming out of college now, back boomers, even millennials, Gen X, they were able to get a good, well-paying job in their 20s. Now folks coming out, it's in their 30s, throw on top of that student loans, et cetera. That's a pretty uphill battle that you've got to fight.
Right. It's a challenge, but I believe there are ways to address this. We just have to think outside the box if we are going to provide a way to overcome some of these challenges.
You mean we need to think outside of the concrete walls that we've erected? So you're out there all the time. You're seeing folks that are doing good things out there. So what are you seeing between the higher ed leaders in this area and the also-rans?
Well, first of all, if you have a selective institution, that is one where not everybody gets in, where there's a reputation for being strong and excellent, and really their bragging rights about being accepted into one of these institutions, they have done significantly better than the non-selective institutions during this period of time. In fact, the market that drives that area continues to grow as families do better financially in the upper middle class, and they have the ability to pay for these more expensive educations. These schools all show exemplary intake statistics. They're obviously tough to get into. They have solid endowments. They have world-class faculty, incredible facilities, an established reputational network. If you have a degree from one of the top tier institutions, it's not very difficult to find a job and to connect with other people who come from that particular background.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting, but that's always been the case with the Harvards, that elite tier. But we're seeing that same sort of thing coming down into R2 schools, things like that. Institutions that are becoming more selective, and they are known for something from their graduates, from the people who hire their graduates.
Right. They benefit from a strong reputation, and there have been books written about different colleges that engaged in trying to turn their reputations around. One was Elon College in North Carolina that was able to come up with a way to improve their reputation and really recruit from all over the country. Other colleges have done this, but what's interesting that we've noted in our work is that schools that are struggling, instead of moving toward becoming more selective, they actually move toward becoming less selective because they're so desperate to add more students. They just want to find a way a gimmick or some kind of mechanism to add more to their population. So we have some ideas about what people should be doing with respect to improving selectivity on a program level that we're sharing with different clients these days. But for now, it's critical for these institutions to look carefully at how they are positioned in the marketplace. Mm-hmm. And answer some of the more critical questions that I think the market is asking, their students are asking, families are asking. What makes you unique or different or better than someone else? How do we stand versus the competition, the other people you're looking at in the higher ed marketplace? Why would you choose us and not someone who looks on the surface to be similar to us? Who is hiring our graduates? Who is it that wants to attend our institution? And what kind of people are donating money to our institutions? We need to understand where we stand, first of all, as an institution, what the market thinks of us, but also how do we find a way to effectively reposition ourselves in the eyes of the market?
It really does just boil down to positioning and marketing. And those criteria that you mentioned is something that we work with our clients all the time. Positioning answers that question. What is the one thing that's unique, different, and better about us in the eyes of the customer? And higher ed has a difficult time defining who their customer is. We can talk about that later. But compared to the competition, that has us hiring our graduates. All those things are critical. And the majority of higher ed institutions don't understand how critical that positioning and marketing is. But seeing we're talking about finance, we're not going to go into that in a whole lot of depth. That's going to be a different podcast.
That's right. When the finance people start talking about marketing, you realize you better head for the exits.
Yeah. So right now, you've seen some folks that are doing things really well. In kind of generalizing things, and we can go down deeper as we need to, what do higher ed institutions need to be thinking about and be doing to remain sustainable going forward? I mean, there's a lot of things, but is there a silver bullet? Probably not. You've got to do multiple things.
Yeah, there isn't a silver bullet, Drumm, and I recognize the fact that people have been looking for this for too long. I've sat through too many leadership team meetings where we've talked about what really are initiatives. Maybe they're more like gimmicks to try and get a few more bodies in the door. But to me, the first step comes from a statement I heard some years ago. We hear it frequently. Reality is your friend. And that is, if you ignore reality, you're going to wind up with what we see so often, and that is the mid-year budget cut. The mid-year budget cut is the worst example of adjusting spending there can possibly be, because there are things you can't cut at that point. You've got faculty on contract. You're not going to let faculty go in the middle of the year. You have a lot of other areas where you have long-term relationships and you've made commitments during the year. You can't make those reductions. So what do? We eliminate staffing. Now, I say to people, well, the mid-year cut can be forgiven if it happens one time. That is, you got caught off guard. You thought you were going to have a pretty good sized incoming class. Didn't happen. Discounts went crazy. Something happened that was not expected. But when it happens more than 1 year, it's on purpose. It reflects the way that we choose to manage the enterprise. That is, when we put our budgets together, we're very optimistic. We budget at the top end of expectation or beyond that. And then we lay it upon the people in enrollment. Here, go out there and get those students when they could say, I'm not really sure I can pull this off. So being real, understanding the market that you're dealing with, the demographic realities of today, is the first step toward understanding what needs to be done to improve the institution.
Yeah, I remember a conversation that I had with a CFO from John Brown University, and her name is escaping me. We were talking about finance during COVID and risk management. Kim Hadley, that's it. And she said that she literally developed 8 different budgets, culled those down to 3 to 5, which went to the board. And she said, best case, worst case, expected case. And they didn't budget on best case. They budgeted on expected or worst case, and they were not disappointed. They were able to maintain enrollment as they needed to.
Yes, that's true. In fact, you really need to, I say to people, if you have a range of expectation, put your revenues at the 25th percentile of that range. I'm not saying, 25% of what you're going to make in total, but I'm saying in the range of expectation, 25th percentile. So there is a 3 out of 4 chance that you'll exceed what you are putting in there. So that's one piece of it. The second piece of it is always have a contingency. People need to have a serious contingency. It should be at least 2% of your budget. And it's a real contingency, not we budgeted at 110% of what we expect. And as a result, we've got a contingency over here to help us out. No, make it real, because things will happen. In Florida, where I live, we have hurricanes. Hurricanes have an impact on a lot of things. And of course, the insurance doesn't cover a whole lot on hurricanes. So you've got to be prepared for that. That should be in your budget. God forbid that your successful athletics should go on for postseason play. Well, if they do, it may cost you some money to send them on. That's a wonderful problem to have, but you want to make sure those things are in the budget. Or the second semester doesn't happen as you hope. But being somewhat, I don't say conservative. People use the word conservative. It's merely being realistic about what the expectations are. And then you can say to the enrollment folks, what's your goal? What do you believe you will deliver to us? And then we go slightly below what they know they can deliver to us and create our budget around that. So if they do exceed their goal, they're saying, wow, this is great and this is benefiting the institution. Too often, enrollment people will exceed what should have been expected of them, and we're told, well, enrollment didn't bring in enough people. Well, that's because our planning process is wrong.
Mm-hmm. And every institution has at least 1 or 2 students whose last name is Murphy, as in Murphy's Law. So
that is correct.
So you just, how do you know a lawyer is lying when he's moving his lips? Well, sometimes you could say the same thing about enrollment projections. You've got to be really realistic, especially with so many students who are applying to multiple schools and they're accepted. And what's your census? What is the actual yield that you have from all your acceptances? It's probably going to be in the vicinity of 70%.
Right. And this is what's interesting to me is that a number of schools have overcome some of those issues with competition by focusing on exemplary programs. You can't turn a school from being less selective to being more selective or most selective overnight. But you can look at certain programs. For instance, nursing tends to be one where not everybody gets in. And education is another one. And for some schools, accounting is that way. And there are many other programs that are top tier exemplary. So make it difficult to get into them. And again, we're getting into marketing here, but I see this in a lot of institutions. Those that focus on their strongest programs tend to have a higher level of selectivity in those programs and have greater success. And this is why it's really important to understand what kind of dollars are being brought in by our programs. Students are bringing a certain amount of money throughout their course schedule, and it's their tuition less their discount. So what is that? And compare that to what the faculty member is making for teaching that class, and that's what we call a level 1 contribution margin. We need to understand that for our programs, so we know what it is that we are receiving from these programs. For instance, there are a lot of schools that love to give away huge awards for bright students, which seems to be a wonderful way to grab bright students who might not otherwise consider a less selective school. However, for those programs like nursing that are very selective themselves, when we give away a huge amount of money to a student who just wants to get in the program, we are leaving a significant amount of money on the table.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, we wind up with less funding for what can be a very expensive, although very important program. So it's important, I think, besides being realistic, to understand what programs are generating in terms of marginal revenues.
Mm-hmm. So becoming real about your situation, understanding your marketing and positioning, and becoming more selective. What about investing in your future? I know that's important as well.
Well, it is. And here's the interesting challenge. Too often I hear people say, we don't want to reduce any more than we absolutely have to. What that often means is that they make reductions in the areas that involve their seed corn, the areas where there is possibility for a new selective program that could be implemented. We back that off. The example I would give is Ford Motor Company. There's a book that I really enjoy called American Icon, written by a guy named Bryce Hoffman. And he had access to the Ford Motor Company starting in around 2005, all the way through the period of time when Ford did not declare bankruptcy and the other two major producers in America did. So they had a plan they put together. They realized that the break-even point was down from 17 million to 10.4 million, about a 40% reduction in break-even. They figured out how to get their manufacturing facilities down to that level for break-even, and they were investing in the future. Well, their CFO got nervous, and their CFO said, we think we're going to have to cut back on investing. And the CFO wound up retiring at age 56, and the CEO, Al Mullally, wound up continuing with the program, sticking to it. And at that point in time, Ford emerged as one of the strongest organizations in their marketplace in 2012, 2013. So choose the plan, stick with it. And if you make reductions, avoid making reductions to the area that involve the opportunity for you to avoid this problem in the future.
Yeah. And you've got to understand your market. You have got to understand what's your core competencies. I mean, I read a book years ago, Competing for the Future by Prahalad and Hamill. And the whole book was about, from a marketing and positioning perspective, understanding what your core competency is. And if you don't have a good one, change it. Take a look at Carnegie Mellon, how they were just a podunk university outside of Pittsburgh. And now they are one of the top in AI, robotics. I mean, they're competing with MIT on many levels because they picked what they wanted to be great in and they focused on it, that plan and executing the plan that you talked about.
Yeah, they didn't try to be all things to all people. And in fact, if you want to do that, you have to have incredible amounts of resources to pull that off. So focus on what you know you can do well. And one of the ways to accomplish this is by partnering with your faculty, understanding what kind of gifts and skills your faculty has, understanding the areas where they might have significant expertise and experience, and then finding ways to use that to create programming that will be attractive to the institution. We seem to have created walls between the administration and the faculty in too many institutions. And the faculty, I think, have a significant amount of genius where they can bring to the party a great level of ideas and experiences that can help you in the transformational process.
Yeah. When we were chatting a couple of days ago, you said something to me that really resonated. It was like, when you think about, you ask a graduate, what did you like about your college experience? They're not going to go and talk about the climbing wall or the meandering stream or other things. They're probably going to be talking about the professor that made the biggest impact on them. Why not enroll those professors, those really stars that you've got, put them on your website, put them on your e-brochures to get the students excited about their programs?
That's right. In fact, the ability for a student to connect with a faculty member is critically important, particularly in the prospective student phase, even if it's just emailing back and forth. But I have seen some of these schools that I think are doing it well. One of them would be to shout out to Stetson University here in Florida that has a wonderful, I looked at their physics program. And of course, physics is not one that's going to generate a lot of students. But here is a YouTube video of a recent grad, 2019, who's sharing her experience in the physics program. Now, the beauty of it is, of course, she's a female. And we think of physics, well, that's mainly male dominated. Here's a woman who had a significantly positive experience at Stetson. So when I'm a prospective student, I'm thinking about physics. I click on this, there's a person. Now, ideally, you have a way to get in touch with that individual, and you also can connect with faculty members so that we are bringing together these processes that we all know as we look back were the most significant influences on our success in higher education. So yeah, absolutely. We should have solid, what I call e-brochures for each program. Other schools, you click on the physics program, it looks like they lifted out of the college catalog. I mean, it was written by people who have no sense for anything. And you'll take, 28 hours and distinct courses that begin in these different levels, and you describe courses. It is just total boredom to read that. So take advantage of the people who love you, who recently graduated from your institution, as examples of success.
Yeah, I'm laughing because I was a physics major at the Naval Academy. And my best experiences that I think back was Herr Dr. Professor Kalam. He was German with a Bostonian accent. He'd gotten his PhD and taught at Boston. He was a character, his favorite people, and he'd always have them in his syllabus. He had the King of Id, he had Darth Vader. I mean, but he made physics fun.
Yeah.
And, he made it applicable. I mean, it's that thing that we said earlier. It's the professor that you realize, the one that you touch base with.
That's right.
Right. There are some other things we're getting. I knew this was going to happen. We're getting toward the end of our time, but let's just keep going. Corporate partnerships are obviously a good thing to do. But I think the biggest thing that folks need to overcome, higher ed has never really had to adapt much. They've always been, this is what we've got, et cetera. You need us. And people are saying, no, we don't need you. There's a fear of changing. So how do we change that? You see it, I see it in our businesses. The classic Einstein definition of insanity, doing the same thing over and over and expecting different results. How do we change that fear, that history of complacency?
Well, I think we have to begin, obviously, as Covey would say, with the end in mind, and that is, what is it that we are hoping to accomplish? And to accomplish what we desire, that is sustainable, healthy institutions that are making a difference in society, we have to get inside the minds of those who are considering us. Let's find out what it is they're looking for. What are their concerns, their fears? And then we hear about zero-based budgeting in higher education, which is interesting, very difficult, and usually doesn't do anything. But what about zero-based programming? That is, looking at what you do and justifying absolutely everything that the institution does, irrespective of the dollars involved. But how does this accomplish our mission and accomplish what it is that our students are looking for in an education? Mm-hmm. How will this get us to where we want to go, which is stronger graduation rates and maybe lower discounts, better revenue, greater programming, more satisfied graduates, all those different components that we hope to measure. How does this particular thing that we're doing get us there?
I've got one client right now who boasts, and rightly so, 95% of their graduates are employed with good jobs in their field. Now it's a very specialized school. It's the Almisi Graduate School for Molecular Medicine, and they train MDs to become researchers. It's an incredible concept. That is a great example of specialization. But looking at it, the graduates are employed. That is, to me, the most critical thing is your graduation rates are great, but your employment rates of your alumni are far more important. And the only way you get that is by having programs that employers want.
That's right. We have to recognize that is the market. As much as we'd love to just merely educate students, we long lost the ability to merely do that when our prices became so high. So we have to be making a difference in society. And that means either graduate school placements or jobs, and measured not just upon graduation, but maybe 5 years or more afterwards to see what it is that the student has accomplished.
Mm-hmm. So, Jeff, this has been fascinating. As I mentioned earlier, we are running out of time or darn close to it. So, as always, 3 takeaways for higher ed presidents and boards.
First of all, be real. Make sure that every plan that you're making has been seasoned with reality. Number 1. Number 2, ensure that the programs that you are promoting are going to be in demand and can lead to selectivity for that particular program. That's very critical. And number 3, surround yourself with the strongest people, not just at the highest level, but at every level of the institution, including, by the way, admission counselors who, in my opinion, should not be 22 and 23-year-old people. But that, to me, those are the 3 takeaways I would say for schools today to try and overcome what we're contending with.
Yeah, I'm going to add one. Don't be afraid to innovate.
Right.
Don't be afraid to innovate, but innovate in the right direction based on market research and positioning.
Correct. Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely. Jeff,
what's next for you?
Well, we continue to try and work with schools. Primarily, the schools we work with are dealing with these same issues, and so we are continuing to address the issues that are confronting us. But for me, I find myself doing a whole lot more speaking and trying to be an evangelist for change in this industry, actually. And that's going to continue. That's where my focus is likely going to be for the foreseeable future.
I can understand. There's a reason I named my business The Change Leader.
There you go.
and our logo has a baseball bat in it. No, I'm just kidding. Jeff, it's been a pleasure to reconnect. Thank you so much for being on the show, and hope to see you at an upcoming conference in person.
Thank you so much. We'll be in touch.
I look forward to it, my friend. Take care. Thanks for listening today, and a special thank you to Jeff Spear of CFO Colleague for his sharing his thoughts on what struggling colleges need to do to turn around their situations. Our next guest is John White, former Chancellor of the University of Arkansas. Under his leadership at Arkansas, the The institution grew and improved dramatically in almost every metric, leading David Gerhardt, 5th Chancellor of the university, to say in 2008, "Perhaps no one in the university's history oversaw more qualitative and quantitative changes than Chancellor White, changes that are deep, dramatic, and certain to endure." John will be joining us to talk about higher ed governance, a topic with which he's very familiar by having sat on multiple corporate and higher ed boards, and how higher ed governance is changing, why it must change to ensure higher ed remains relevant.
Changing Higher Ed is a production of The Change Leader, a consultancy committed to transforming higher ed institutions. Find more information about this topic, along with show notes on this episode at changinghighered.com. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to the show, and we would also value your honest rating and review. Email any questions, comments, or recommendations for topics or guests to podcast@changinghighered.com. Changing Higher Ed is produced and hosted by Dr. Drumm McNaughton, post-production by David L. White.